What's new? Israel's devastating war with Hamas in Gaza has diverted attention from systemic and growing violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Increasingly, the settlers are acting in concert with the army or wearing army uniforms themselves. They enjoyed the active support of far-right Israeli government ministers. Why does it matter? Settler violence, which has gone unchecked for years, is both a manifestation and a driver of Israel's settlement enterprise. Some 700,000 Israelis now live in West Bank settlements, including in East Jerusalem, rendering resolution of the conflict an ever more remote possibility. What should be done? Outside powers invested in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should sanction violent settlers, as some Western countries have started doing, and officials enabling violence. They should curb sales of weapons used in violation of international law, and raise the costs the Israeli government pays for settler violence and the settlement project. Executive Summary. Israeli settler violence, a phrase referring to ways in which Israelis living in the occupied West Bank terrorize, harm, and at times kill Palestinians and destroy their property, is at an all-time high. For decades, Israeli governments have failed to check and often tolerated such violence, but it has escalated significantly since late 2022, when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government came to power, rising further after the Hamas-led 7 October attack on Israeli communities around Gaza. The government has boosted Israel's settlement project, while ministers close to hardliners in the settler movement openly cheer attacks on Palestinians. Sanctions the U.S. and European countries have imposed on some violent settlers are a start, but ignore that much of the responsibility lies with the Israeli state. Western countries should use their military aid to Israel and economic relations with it to impose greater costs on Israel for settlement expansion and settler violence that directly contradict their own stated policy and are making many parts of the West Bank increasingly unlivable for Palestinians. Since the 1967 war, during which it seized the West Bank, Israel has exercised military rule over the Palestinian population and expropriated more and more Palestinian land. Today, 230,000 Israelis live in occupied East Jerusalem and about 500,000 in the rest of the West Bank, both of which are internationally recognized as occupied territory. Israeli institutions, particularly the Supreme Court, and Israeli governments, notably that of Yitzhak Rabin in the mid-1990s, have sometimes made rulings or adopted policies curbing settlement activity. But the big picture is clear. Over decades, successive Israeli governments have enabled or encouraged an entrenched occupation in the West Bank that has seen ever more settlers move in. Leaders have usually cited security as the reason to build settlements, but in some cases, they have shared settlers' ideologically motivated drive to annex the area. Under Netanyahu's government, land seizures in the West Bank increased dramatically even before the Hamas-led 7 October attack. Violence by settlers against Palestinians, which for decades has accompanied settlement expansion, has also spiked in recent years. The aggressive acts, often perpetrated by gangs of armed young men, range from verbal intimidation and harassment to theft of livestock to assaults on Palestinians in which the settlers uproot farmers' olive trees and deny them access to land and water. In some cases, violence is motivated by revenge. When Israeli settlers are hurt in a Palestinian attack in the West Bank, for example, settlers retaliate. Settlers ran riot through the West Bank villages of Huwara and Termus Aya, destroying property, terrorizing residents, and clashing with Palestinians, despite neither village having any evident link to the shootings that supposedly triggered the attack. But if some violence is retribution, much of it aims to dispossess Palestinians, expand settlements, and extinguish any hope of Palestinian statehood. The 7 October attack and war in Gaza have made things even worse. aided by an army recruitment drive that provided settlers with weapons and uniforms to protect their own communities as reservists, and emboldened by a far-right government committed to expanding Israeli control of the West Bank, settlers have seized thousands of acres of West Bank land from Palestinians over the past year alone. Since 7 October, there have been over 1,000 incidents of settler violence, in which over 1,300 Palestinians have been driven from their homes. Rarely do Israeli courts convict settlers accused of violent acts. Israeli institutions have largely failed to rein in settlers. The traditional security establishment has increasingly criticized the violence, warning that it and the far-right's influence stoke instability in the West Bank and strain Israel's ties to Washington. Soldiers sometimes stand between settlers and Palestinians and may themselves face attacks by hardline settlers. Overall, though, the military's rank and file, like the police officers whose job it is to investigate settler crimes, see their primary obligation as protecting Jewish Israelis' interests and what they define as Israel's security, an imperative to which the courts invariably defer. Rarely do courts convict settlers accused of violent acts. Nor is settler violence the work of a few bad apples, as centrist politicians tend to paint it. As the army, like society, shifts rightward, instances of soldiers and settlers working in unison are more common. Plus, hardline settlers, once on the fringes of Israeli politics, today hold posts that give them power over West Bank affairs. They endorse settler violence by framing it as self-defense in a battle for land to which they say Israel is entitled. The uptick in settler violence has led Western governments to sanction individual settlers. In a 1 February executive order, the Biden administration put in place a framework for designating individuals and entities for sanctions. It has now listed 24 individuals and entities. European capitals and the EU have followed suit. In taking such steps, Western capitals have gone further than they have been ready to go previously, signaling to Israeli officials that they regard settler violence as a serious problem requiring urgent redress. Still, sanctioning individuals obscures the problem's core, reinforcing the narrative of a few lawbreakers acting outside the state's purview and taking the onus off the government. Western capitals, which mostly concur that settlements break international law, should go further. The U.S. could enforce domestic statutes already in effect. For example, by cutting assistance to Israeli military units that the U.S. knows have committed gross violations of human rights. European governments could better apply rules for trade with Israel involving goods made in West Bank settlements, or ban trade in those products altogether. Both the U.S. and Europe could consider sanctioning far-right cabinet members who applaud settler violence, a politically difficult move, but one that would signal where responsibility lies. Such steps will not necessarily force an about-face in Israel's policies, but they would raise costs for its failure to curb settler violence, and they might dent in the impunity that has helped empower Israel's far-right over decades. Since October 2023, the West Bank has taken a back seat to the war and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, exchanges of fire on the Israel-Lebanon border, and fears of a wider Middle East war. Yet the settlement expansion and surging settler violence in the West Bank upping the likelihood of a larger outbreak of violence there. Western powers appear reluctant to take stronger action. In the U.S. in particular, any change in policy may have to wait until after the November elections, and what is feasible then will almost certainly hinge on the results. For their part, European capitals are split on how to respond. Yet Western leaders' repeated calls for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states have long rung hollow absent firmer measures to check the settlements that are killing off hope of Palestinian statehood. Source: Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Washington, Brussels, 6 September 2024. Introduction. Some 500,000 Jewish Israeli citizens live in the occupied West Bank in over 300 settlements and outposts established since the June 1967 war. Another 200,000 or so live in East Jerusalem, which Israel annexed after the war. Most settlers live in urban or suburban settlements from which they can commute to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as the majority of settlers work inside Israel. Nearly half of them live in 4 large settlement blocks in different parts of the West Bank. More isolated but established settlements, as well as newer, more ideologically driven hilltop settlements and settlement outposts, are sprinkled throughout the West Bank countryside. International courts have repeatedly held that the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is occupied territory under international law, a status that is inherently temporary, and that the Fourth Geneva Convention governs Israel's actions there. In July, the International Court of Justice found, as it had in 2004, that Israel's settlement policy is in breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention's Article 49, which provides that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Its advisory decision also stated that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel rejects characterizations of the settlements as illegal because it rejects the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention in the territories it occupied in 1967. Among other theories it has advanced, it has argued that there was no previous legitimate sovereign in the case of the West Bank. Bank and East Jerusalem, which were both under Jordanian rule from 1948 to 1967, and Gaza, which was run by Egypt. Thus, there is no one to whom to return these territories following negotiations. Israel treats the occupied territories as administered. In Israeli discourse, the West Bank is generally known by biblical names, Judea for the part south of Jerusalem and Samaria to Jerusalem's north. The settlements, whose expansion has accelerated over the last few years, make the prospect that a viable Palestinian state could emerge in these territories increasingly distant, if not impossible to imagine. Western states, including Israel's closest ally, the U.S., have pressed Israel to halt its settlement drive, both because of legal concerns and because the settlements would impede a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to no avail. Indeed, weathering outside pressure has emboldened successive Israeli governments to enlarge the settlement project as Israeli politics drift steady rightward. Over the past few years, since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's current government, which includes far-right parties, assumed power, and especially since the Hamas-led attacks on 7 October 2023, the tempo of both settlement activity and acts of settler violence against Palestinians has increased dramatically. This report takes a close look at the roots and drivers of settler violence, the reasons for its recent acceleration, its ties to Israeli government aims, and the impediments it creates to efforts at achieving a just, sustainable peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It also offers recommendations for how Israel's Western partners can better impose costs on the Israeli government for supporting and enabling this behavior. It draws on dozens of interviews with Israeli, Palestinian, and U.S. officials, local representatives and leaders, academics, legal and human rights experts, as well as Israeli settlers and Palestinian West Bank residents. The majority of the interviewees were men, reflecting a gendered power divide in this conflict, both at the government level and on the ground. The West Bank and what he presented as a security belt. A 1978 plan drafted by another official, Meticulously, went a step further, sketching ideas for settling Israelis in what became known as settlement blocks throughout the West Bank, which would require dividing up Palestinian areas. Likud's brazenness triggered a response from within the Israeli system, in which constituencies favoring peace based on territorial compromise remained strong. In an unprecedented 1979 ruling, Israel's Supreme Court ordered the dismantling of the Ilan Moreh settlement in the West Bank, citing the notion that settlers cannot seize privately owned Palestinian land when the state cannot provide a clear security rationale. Ilhan Moray was the brainchild of Gush Emunim, a tenacious group of ideological settlers. Its members did not refer to security at all, instead claiming a divine right as Jews to settle the historic land of Israel. The Supreme Court ordered the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, to expel the settlers and return the seized land to its Palestinian owner. But even after complying, the IDF confiscated land from nearby Palestinian villages, claiming it was state land to re-establish Ilhan Moray. While the court's decision set an important precedent, formally barring Israelis from expropriating privately owned Palestinian land to build settlements absent a security rationale, it led the state to find new ways to dispossess Palestinians. Israeli courts ruled repeatedly against land and property claims by Palestinians, who faced difficulty in proving ownership with what often were incomplete documents dating from the Ottoman period. The court interpreted the rule of law, in many cases, to rejecting Palestinian claims and thus allowing West Bank settlements to grow. The next decade saw the emergence of a new official settlement strategy, declaring areas in the West Bank to be state land. Campaigning on a platform that included settlement expansion, Begin won re-election in 1981 by a large margin. His government then adapted Ottoman law, under which land not registered as private and remaining uncultivated for at least 3 consecutive years became property of the empire, or in this case, Israel, the administering power. In this manner, Israel declared over 1.4 million dunams, 140,000 hectares of land in the West Bank, or about a quarter of the entire territory, as state land between 1981 and 2018, allocating the majority of it for Israeli settlements. This redesignation enabled settlers to block Palestinian access to agricultural and grazing lands, invariably with force of arms and often backed by the IDF, provoking confrontations and setting the stage for escalating violence. Ma'ale Lavona settlement surrounded by Palestinian agricultural land. It was established in 1983 by the Gush Emunim movement. Many Israeli settlements are strategically placed on elevated terrain. Source, in September 2023, Crisis Group / Jorge Gutierrez, Lucena. Ideology as the driving force of settlement building. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's Labor government in 1992 was the first and only one to take concrete preliminary steps to curtail settlement expansion, doing so even before the 1993 signing of the Oslo Accords. Although the accords did not include a provision explicitly barring new settlements, one of the agreement's major flaws, they launched a process that many Israelis and Palestinians believed would lead to a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While the establishment of formal settlements slowed after Oslo until the outbreak of the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, the accords led to a reorganization and ultimately entrenchment of Israeli control of Palestinian territory. The accords created a mechanism that, even as the parties were negotiating, ended up paving the way for continued Israeli settlement while relieving the Israeli occupying power of the burden of providing for the needs of the civilian population. This mechanism consisted of outsourcing daily administration of parts of the West Bank to the newly established Palestinian Authority, PA, while dividing the West Bank into 3. Area A consisted of Palestinian urban centers, where the PA now nominally had full administrative and security control. Area B was made up of Palestinian towns and villages over which the PA exercised administrative control but shared security control with Israel. And Area C, which remained fully controlled by Israel and which Israel, according to the accords, would gradually transfer to Palestinian jurisdiction. Area C, covering 60% of the West Bank, comprised rural tracts where Israel's expanding settlements were located. The PA was supposed to administer civil affairs for the sparse Palestinian population living in Area C, but Israel's permit and other requirements meant that, in effect, it retained comprehensive control of all aspects of life. As the Rabin government began transferring authority over parts of the West Bank to the PA, the right-wing opposition, feeling betrayed, began aggressively promoting its Greater Israel agenda, in which a Jewish state would stretch from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea across the occupied West Bank. This vision galvanized the settler movement to establish new outposts. Usually extensions of existing settlements, these were illegal even under Israeli law, since many were built on land Israeli courts recognized as Palestinian-owned, and most were unauthorized by bureaucratic procedures. As such, they were part of the pattern of creating facts, new settlements, which the government in many cases eventually permitted, whether de facto by not evacuating them or de jure by legalizing them. As a result, the settler population in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and Golan Heights grew from 281,800 in 1993 to 427,617 a decade later. A right-wing narrative came to the fore, insisting that withdrawing from the occupied territories would constitute capitulation to Palestinian violence. In the aftermath of the failed Camp David summit in 2000, the peace process crumbled, and Israel's peace camp went into decline. Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the last labor leader to hold power, declared that Israel no longer had a Palestinian partner. As the Second Intifada raged, a right-wing narrative came to the fore, insisting that withdrawing from the occupied territories would constitute capitulation to Palestinian violence and undermine national security. Against this backdrop, a new generation of settlers known as Hilltop Youth, children of those who had founded the first settlements, resorted to ever more violent attacks on the Palestinians whom they were aiming to displace. In 2005, the government released the Sasson Report, commissioned by Sharon, then Prime Minister, in response to U.S. pressure to dismantle the outposts and halt state funding for settlements. By that time, there were 105 settler outposts in the West Bank. The report found not only that Israel was systematically failing to enforce the law, but also that the executive echelon, especially regional settlement councils in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as officials working in various ministries and state agencies, were directly involved in breaking the law by green-lighting outposts without government authorization. It also said the IDF was safeguarding Israeli citizens residing illegally in the occupied territories, even as it was supposed to maintain order in the West Bank and Gaza and protect the Palestinian population, as per international law. The outcome, the report said, was that the settlers are the ones who set the army's deployment in the territories, not the army. It first looked as though the Sasson Report might induce Israel to scale back West Bank settlement. Sharon set up a ministerial team to examine its recommendations, which included dismantling settler outposts built on private Palestinian land, prohibiting the housing ministry from planning new settlements or neighborhoods in existing settlements without a prior political decision, a practice that had become more common in the mid-1990s, and blocking the defense ministry from connecting settler outposts to electricity and water. The rate of establishing new settler outposts went down, as instead the government put its efforts into expanding existing settlements, replacing illegal actions under Israeli law with ostensibly legal ones. C. The settlers' battle for Area C. The Sasson Report did not deliver lasting or structural change in settlement policy. Sharon's decision to withdraw Israeli forces and settlers from the Gaza Strip, known as disengagement, took up a great deal of the state's attention while easing U.S. pressure. After Sharon suffered a stroke in January 2006, the report was in effect shelved. Its author later claimed that the report did have some practical impact on the ground. It slowed down the establishment of new settler outposts, made government officials think twice before engaging in illegal actions to authorize them, and streamlined the IDF's ability to remove outposts. In reality, though, once Netanyahu assumed power in 2009, the establishment of outposts accelerated. More recently, organizations such as Amana, a non-governmental cooperative society that may be the settler movement's most effective arm, have begun establishing herder outposts in Area C, the 60% of the West Bank that, under the Oslo Accords, is under full Israeli control. Almost all the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, as well as most of the territory's natural resources, are located in Area C. The settlers largely framed this activity as a response to a PA plan produced in 2009 by Salam Fayyad, then the prime minister, which sought to advance prospects for a Palestinian state through construction and infrastructure projects in the West Bank, especially Area C, in the absence of a peace process. Settlers, and increasingly the state and media as well, have started to cast Palestinian construction in Area C as an attempt to take over Jewish land. The settler strategy, which they have dubbed the battle over Area C, appears to start with a single settler or settler family claiming a large tract of land, ostensibly for farming or herding purposes. This land then becomes an outpost for a somewhat larger number of settlers. In the period 2017-2021, Israelis built over 50 new single-family outposts in the West Bank, at least 35 of which are used for shepherding, mainly in open expanses in the Jordan Valley, in the South Hebron Hills, and east of Ramallah, where isolated Bedouin herding communities live. Palestinian herder Mohammed Mahmoud al-Hamamdi stands among his flock in Masafer Yatta, south of the West Bank. He has endured numerous confrontations with settlers who lay claim to large tracts of land for farming or herding. Crisis Group Jorge Gutierrez Lucena. Regional settlement councils, which sometimes bypass government approval and establish new settlements de facto by facilitating home building, forging permits, and paving roads to the outposts, collaborate with non-governmental entities such as Amana to help settlers with construction and lobby the government not to demolish newly established settlements. The Settlement Division of the World Zionist Organization, a quasi-governmental agency that operates as the settlement's main contractor, grants state authority to manage lands, in many cases allocating the right to the land to Amana, usually for free. Settlers often work hand-in-hand with the IDF in seizing land in Area C. The right-wing organization Regavam, co-founded in 2006 by Bezalel Smotrich, who brought many former staff members with him when he entered the Netanyahu government in late 2022, operates through both the Knesset and the Defense Ministry's civil administration to crack down on Palestinian construction. Usually unable to get a permit, the Palestinians build in violation of the law, which leaves their homes exposed to destruction by the army for avowedly administrative reasons. The IDF views preventing Palestinian construction in Area C as part of its mandate. A retired Israeli military officer said, "Assuming control of land in Area C is something that the political echelon defined for the army as a mission, one that politicians delegated to the IDF explicitly. It is now bolstered by this government but has existed for at least 3 years, due in large part to years of pressure exerted by settlers on politicians." Crisis Group's Myrav Zonshine speaks with Yusuf Hussein Asmar Basharat, a Palestinian Bedouin herder who has faced repeated harassment from settlers in the Jordan Valley, West Bank. Crisis Group Jorge Gutierrez Lucena. 3. Settlers' violence and motives. Settlers' violence is a catch-all phrase for ways in which Israeli citizens living in the occupied West Bank terrorize and harm Palestinians. In contrast, the security establishment calls these attacks nationalistically motivated crimes because, according to this view, settlers are responding to violence against them by Palestinians, or, in some circles, Jewish terror attacks. Such violence encompasses trespassing and blocking roads or access to land and water sources, setting cars, homes, or other property on fire, stealing or harming livestock, burning or cutting down olive trees, throwing stones at Palestinian cars, vandalizing churches and mosques, and firing at civilians. Settler violence also entails other forms of harassment, intimidation, and abuse. Violence against Palestinians and their property existed to varying degrees from when Israeli citizens began settling in the occupied territories in 1967, but peaked during high-intensity periods like the First and Second Intifadas. It became more systematic after the Oslo Accords, primarily due to determination among settlers to prevent the possibility of a Palestinian state. Escalating settler violence. Until about 2015, settlers referred to their own violence as price tag attacks, attacks carried out to exact a price, whether from Palestinians or the Israeli government. The term gained currency after the 2005 Gaza disengagement, coming into even wider use after the Supreme Court in 2006 ordered the demolition of homes in the settlement of Amona, built on Palestinian-owned land in the West Bank. The settler movement experienced the ensuing confrontations with Israeli forces as a seminal event in which many settlers and security personnel sustained injuries. Dvir Kariv, a former official of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, said, "The Amona evacuation fueled the Hilltop Youth phenomenon. The message young settlers received from the state was, 'We heard you and we don't care.' Even moderate people there who were hurt by soldiers and police became more radical. Some decided they no longer wanted to serve in the army." The Gaza disengagement, Amona demolitions, and resultant clashes between settlers and Israeli forces became turning points, after which ideologically motivated settlers mobilized to shape government policies. They wanted to discourage the government from evacuating settlements and making concessions to Palestinians in the West Bank by threatening violence if it followed through with such measures. Price tag attacks, often involving vandalism of Palestinian property with signature price tag graffiti, at times also targeted Israeli facilities or forces, including both soldiers and the border police. In September 2011, for example, settlers spray-painted slogans on the wall of the IDF's West Bank headquarters denouncing the Army's demolition of houses at a settler outpost. They also vandalized several Army vehicles. In 2013, price tag attacks had become so rampant that Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the establishment of a special police unit entitled the Nationalistically Motivated Crimes Unit to deal with the phenomenon, adding officers to the highly understaffed Israeli police force in the West Bank. Yet the incidents of settler violence did not go down. An investigation some years later found that the police unit had been ineffectual. Two incidents that ended in the deaths of several Palestinians, including children, momentarily brought significant attention to settler violence. The first was the murder of Mohammed Abu Qadir in Jerusalem on 5 July 2014. The perpetrators, who kidnapped the 16-year-old Abu Qadir and burned him alive, claimed to be retaliating for the abduction and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank a month earlier. In the second incident, on 31 July 2015, a settler killed a couple and their 18-month-old son in the village of Duma after firebombing their house. An Israeli court convicted him of murder. Both these incidents, in which Israelis burned Palestinian children alive, were shocking to many Israelis, widely covered in Israeli media and condemned by the leadership, but did not lead to a lasting reduction in settler violence. In both cases, the perpetrators were given life sentences. Yet the stiff punishments were exceptional, and because the incidents were so extreme, many among the Israeli public did not view them as part of the phenomenon of settler violence. In the immediate aftermath of the Duma attack, Israeli authorities stepped up deterrent actions against radical settlers, using administrative detention, interrogations, and restraining orders to keep certain settlers out of the West Bank. Settler violence accordingly decreased in the years 2016-2017. But late in 2017, it began to climb again, partly in response to a crackdown on settlers, which reportedly included torture during investigations, and partly due to a general assent of more radical settler leaders to municipal councils and West Bank settlements. In 2018, the number of violent incidents more than tripled compared with the preceding year, and it has increased steadily every year since. Settler violence incidents and subsequent fatalities and injuries per year have all spiked since Netanyahu's latest coalition government took office and again increased dramatically after the Hamas-led attack of 7 October. Source: UN OCHA, Crisis Group. Settler violence has spiked since Netanyahu's latest coalition government, which includes ministers from far-right parties, took office in December 2022. Even before the Hamas-led attack on 7 October, Israeli settlers had killed at least 10 Palestinians in 2023, while engaging in harassment, vandalism, and assault on hundreds of occasions, including several mass rampages. According to the UN, the first half of 2023 witnessed 591 settler attacks, an average of 95 per month or about 3 per day. This number marked a 39% increase over a similar period in 2022 and the sixth consecutive annual increase. The Israeli security establishment's own data for the first half of 2023 showed a sharp rise in Jewish terror attacks in the West Bank. Its statistics primarily count acts such as torching homes and otherwise damaging Palestinian property, such instances more than in all of 2022. It also documented 680 friction incidents between Israelis and Palestinians, such as throwing stones and physical altercations, compared with 950 in all of 2022. The uptick in violence has included several unprecedented settler rampages in which mobs of dozens or even hundreds of settlers, mainly men and boys, attacked Palestinian villages. On 15 August, at least 100 settlers entered the northern West Bank village of Jit, firing bullets and tear gas and torching cars and homes, killing a Palestinian and injuring several others. In earlier rampages, settlers attacked the West Bank villages of Huwara and Termas Aya in February and June 2023 respectively, following Palestinian shooting attacks that killed Israelis. In Huwara, a Palestinian was killed and hundreds injured, while in Termas Aya, a Palestinian was killed and 10 others were injured. More settlers participated in the assaults than had been part of previous attacks. The rampages left dozens of homes and cars burned. The Israeli settlement of Shiloh is seen from Termas Aya. In June 2023, settlers from Shiloh attacked this Palestinian village, burning down cars and killing one man. September 2023, Crisis Group. Alongside the rash of settler attacks, settlement activity has also increased. The year 2023 saw approval of a record number of building permits for new settlement housing units, nearly 13,000, and erection of an unprecedented number of new settler outposts, 26. Since the beginning of 2024, Israel has declared state ownership of 23,700 dunams, almost 6,000 acres of West Bank land. More than in any previous calendar year. On 25 June, Israel designated over 3,000 acres in the Jordan Valley as state land, the single largest seizure of occupied land in 30 years. In the aftermath of the 7 October Hamas-led attack, incidents of settler violence again increased dramatically. As Israel fell into a state of shock and trauma, and with all eyes on Gaza, settlers in the West Bank felt emboldened. The result was another spike of settler violence in a year that was already breaking records, involving more shootings of Palestinians that often appear to be motivated by revenge. In November, the UN reported a rise in settler violence from an already high average of 3 incidents per day in 2023 to 7 a day after 7 October. In the intervening months, settlers have killed 10 more Palestinians, and an additional 7 Palestinians have been killed, all with live ammunition, in instances where it remains unknown if the perpetrators were soldiers or settlers. In the period between 7 October and 12 August, the UN recorded 1,264 settler attacks on Palestinians that resulted in casualties, damage to property, or both, causing 21 fatalities and 643 injuries, and destroying nearly 23,000 Palestinian-owned trees, which for many farmers are the main source of livelihood. The rise in attacks is significant, considering that there were 860 of them in all of 2023 until 7 October. In roughly the same period, at least 1,378 Palestinians, including 656 children, were displaced due to harassment and intimidation by settlers. Settler motives. In perpetrating violence, settlers have 2 main motives, which tend to overlap and reinforce each other: retaliation and dispossession. Settlers carry out retaliatory or revenge attacks following violence by Palestinians, the usual form of which involves Palestinians hurling rocks at passing Israeli cars in the West Bank. In 2015, Israel toughened laws against throwing stones, with the judiciary imposing much harsher penalties on Palestinians than on Israelis accused of the offense, but without curbing Palestinian attacks on settlers. As exercised by West Bank settlers, retaliation is a broad concept. Following an attack by Palestinians on Israelis in the West Bank, settlers may go on a rampage against Palestinians with no obvious connection to the precipitating incident. The government and security establishment have occasionally condemned this type of violence and even taken action against it. As a former Shin Bet official working to combat Jewish vigilantism described it, settlers act out at what they call İşgalAltındakiTopraklar, or the boiling point. This Aramaic term from Jewish scripture denotes a situation in which settlers fume in the hours and days after a Palestinian attack, prompting the security forces to go on high alert to prevent reprisals. The rampages in Hawara and Termis Aya in early 2023 are examples. The 2 attacks took place shortly after the Netanyahu government took office in late 2022, with settlers reportedly emboldened by settler government ministers. Settlers' second and more fundamental motive in committing violence is to drive West Bank Palestinians off and seize their lands, especially in Area C. Repeated acts of violence originating in settler outposts have led a number of Palestinian Bedouin communities to leave, in what Israeli and international organizations call forcible transfer. The UN has reported that in the past 2 years, at least 7 communities in Area C have been displaced due to an increasingly coercive environment that includes state policies such as demolition of homes and other structures, compounded by settler violence. More remain at risk. On 24 June 2023, settlers attacked the village of Ain al-Rashash, for example, prompting Israeli and international activists to stay there round the clock to provide moral support and shield the residents from attempts at expelling them. But such efforts dwindled after 7 October, whereupon settlers increased their attacks. By 16 October, all the residents, about 85 people, had fled. Salamaza Walda, a Palestinian Bedouin from Ain al-Rashash, was attacked by settlers in June 2023 and injured in the head. September 2023. Crisis Group, George Guterres Lucena. Settler violence often seems aimed at displacing Palestinians by hurting them economically. In many cases over the years, settler violence has spiked during the olive harvest, when settlers uproot trees and attack farmers, depriving them of a principal source of income. In the case of Bedouin herding communities in the West Bank, whose entire livelihood has been based for generations on access to land where their herds graze and drink, the economic impact of settler violence can also be devastating, locking herders in a debt spiral by forcing them to buy fodder and water. An Israeli human rights activist said, "The Palestinian herding sector in the West Bank is on the verge of collapse. We used to say there is a risk of forcible transfer, but it's already happening." There is a strong correlation between the number of settler attacks and Palestinians' abandonment of lands stretching east from Ramallah. Shepherds in the Jordan Valley have accused Israel of pursuing a policy of ethnic cleansing enforced by a combination of settler violence, army protection, and police inaction. It is not only Area C that has been affected. In the old city of Hebron, in Area A, Palestinian residents have abandoned a third of the housing units in neighborhoods adjacent to Israeli settlement compounds due to IDF-imposed access restrictions, as well as systematic settler harassment and violence since Israel began settling the city after 1967. While large-scale incidents of settler violence have commanded most public attention, the government and media pay little or no attention to the vast majority of settler-related incidents, which involve daily instances of intimidation and harassment that do not directly inflict or threaten to inflict physical wounds or damage property. They may include blocking access to water sources or pastures, or just showing up at Palestinian homes. This kind of undocumented and less visible settler violence is especially pernicious because it receives little to no attention. It may have no immediate, tangible impact, but rather has a cumulative effect of instilling fear in the Palestinian population. Settler justifications. Most settlers in the West Bank reside in commuter settlements for the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem conurbations, their daily lives far removed from the violence that tends to involve a smaller number of Israelis in ideologically inspired settlements, especially the radical hilltop ones. They hold a range of views on why they chose to live in occupied territory. The majority reject that term, seeing the West Bank as biblical Judea and Samaria, part of the ancient patrimony of the Jewish people, or simply as part of the modern state of Israel. This latter opinion is particularly common among the 200,000 or so settlers living in East Jerusalem, which Israel has annexed and which Israelis consider part of their capital. The more ideological settlers largely do not recognize the violent acts that those in their midst commit as a specific identifiable group phenomenon. They claim that the term settler violence is derogatory, meant to defame all settlers as violent. In the words of a settler leader, "I don't call it settler violence. Crime exists everywhere, in Tel Aviv too. I won't call crime in Tel Aviv violence. Settler violence is a political way to discriminate against an entire population of settlers." Likewise, Shlomo Neyman, who until May was head of the Yesha Council, the umbrella group representing all West Bank settlements, referred to settler violence as mainly involving youths committing crimes and acts of hooliganism. There is a group of 50 people, with another 200 in the outer circle, all youths, who don't listen to anyone. They conduct themselves the same way in other places in Israel, like raping someone in Eilat. This doesn't come from settler institutions. It's a social phenomenon. It exists in Paris and London and also in Israel. By contrast, other settlers decry this type of violence, including taking over hilltops that are known to be Palestinian-owned land, as they see such acts as undermining the overall settlement project, which they prefer to pursue through the legal means that Israeli institutions offer. Davidi Ben-Zion, the deputy head of the Shomron Regional Council, condemned actions by people he termed a tiny group of radical youth, at-risk youth, or anarchists who don't listen to anyone. There are hilltops where I see them as lawbreakers, and those where I see them as pioneers. The question is whether there are institutions and a hierarchy behind it. There are settler outposts that are illegal and not on the right path, and there are others that have institutional backing and eventually will become legal. Crisis group's Myrav Zansign speaks with Davidi Ben-Zion, deputy head of the Shomron Regional Council, in the settlement of Elan Moreh in the West Bank, September 2023. Crisis group Jorge Gutierrez Lucena. Some settlers also justify violence as part of what they consider a necessary battle over agricultural land, but more generally about the right to live in Judea and Samaria. Naaman, for example, said, "It's not settler violence, it's conflict over land. Two sides are at war, and some call it settler violence." Similarly, a resident of the Kumiori outpost said he and his Jewish friends are engaged in a zero-sum battle with Arabs. When any person, any animal, feels threatened, they need to defend themselves. The Arabs say they want to get all the Jews out. It's a war in which we need to fight them to the end. In his opinion, Israel should encourage Palestinians to immigrate, but no one wants to say so openly, he added, because it is deemed racist. He criticized the army for doing too little to protect settlers, compelling settlers to protect themselves. This view finds echoes at the highest levels of political power. A spokesperson for National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir said, "Vigilantism is not acceptable, but the real problem, the major issue we are facing, is the murder of Israelis." Escalating confrontations between Palestinian landowners and Israeli settlers intruding on their properties invariably give rise to settler calls for punitive action against the Palestinians and further land expropriation. In June 2023, after the killing of 4 Israelis in a shooting attack in the settlement of Eli, Ben-Gvir went to Evitar, an illegal outpost that the government had previously demolished but where settlers had been living again for the preceding 4 months. There, he called on Israelis to run to the hilltops. "We have to settle the land of Israel and, at the same time, need to launch a military campaign, blow up buildings, assassinate terrorists. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, hundreds, or, if needed, thousands." In the following days, settlers erected 7 new illegal outposts. Settlers and the state. In the last 2 decades, settlers have increasingly entered the Israeli bureaucracy and mainstream society, and today they hold significant power in those parts of it that run the occupation, including the security apparatus. They have locked horns with authorities such as the judiciary, which at times have curbed settlement building and settler violence. Supreme Court decisions, for example, including the 2006 Amona ruling, have led to the dismantling or relocation of some settlements. Settlers fiercely criticized the courts. They backed changes to the judiciary that Netanyahu tried to force through in 2023, hoping that neutering the judiciary would remove what they see as an obstacle to Israel's annexation of the West Bank. In reality, though, court decisions that enable creeping control of the West Bank have far outnumbered those that check it. The judiciary, like other institutions, has largely abetted the occupation, despite on occasion ruling against settlers. In recent years, even the limited resistance institutions have put up to settlements and settler violence has waned, as the far-right and settler movement gain influence. As settlers' power has increased, expressions of alarm among Israel's traditional security elites have become more urgent. The heads of the Israeli Army, Shin Bet, and Israeli National Police issued a joint statement in June 2023 after a settler rampage, calling it nationalist terrorism. Similarly, in his final remarks as head of Central Command with responsibility for the West Bank, General Yehuda Fuchs, in July 2024, summed up his experience since 7 October. Nationalist crime reared its head under the auspices of war. Unfortunately, the local settler leadership and the religious leadership, for the most part, did not see the threat as we did. Shin Bet Director Ronan Bar leveled the strongest and most direct charge in an August letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu, accusing certain officials in the security establishment of granting legitimacy and even assistance to Jewish terrorists. We're on the threshold of a significant, reality-changing process. The damage to Israel, especially at this time, and to the majority of the settlers, is indescribable. a loss of global legitimacy even among our best friends. Deploying IDF forces at a time the Army, which isn't meant to deal with these missions, is finding it difficult to carry out all its tasks. The ideologues behind this effort support taking apart the state structure. In the name of this worldview, they are willing to jeopardize the state's security and its very existence while undermining confidence in the state's institutions. Barr's letter was an explicit expression of the rising tension between the Prime Minister and his extreme-right coalition allies on one hand and the country's traditional security elites on the other. For Barr and top security officials, what is at stake in the West Bank is not only the lives of the hostages, Israel's international reputation, or the functioning of the Israeli army, but the integrity of the state as the extreme right sits in the cabinet and the army's rank and file shifts rightward even more than Israeli society itself. Impunity despite official condemnation. Particularly, but not only among troops drawn from the settlements, there is increasing tolerance and even open support for settler violence. Those who might not be similarly inclined face pressure from settlers and others that deters them from acting against settler violence, even more so now that settlers enjoy political cover under the Netanyahu government. As an occupying army, the IDF faces an inherent contradiction in its obligation under international and Israeli law. While the former requires it to protect the territory's Palestinian population, the latter requires it, first and foremost, to ensure Israeli citizens' safety there. In performing this dual role, a former head of IDF Central Command said, "The identity of soldiers, their job, is to defend Israelis." And many of the forces are made up of people who identify more with the political right and see settlements as legal and Palestinians as the enemy. They do not see Jews as an enemy, and they do not feel threatened by settler actions. While soldiers do on occasion do their jobs by keeping settlers and Palestinians separated and are themselves sometimes targeted by settlers, in many cases when they come across a confrontation, and regardless of the circumstances, their instinct is to protect the Israelis. As a former Shin Bet official put it, the soldier is confused about what his powers are. He is trained to protect settlers and kill terrorists. Suddenly, when settlers commit a pogrom, he doesn't know what to do. Their main duty is to protect settlers from terrorists. They look for Arab terrorists, not Jewish ones. In many cases of settler attacks on Palestinians, the army will either detain or arrest the Palestinians, not the settlers, or declare the area a closed military zone and evacuate everyone, or just the Palestinians. In the latter instances, the army forces Palestinians tending to olive trees or herding sheep to leave their own land, if temporarily. An IDF soldier stands guard at a checkpoint near the Kiryat Arba settlement, where Israeli settlers wait for the bus. September 2023. Crisis Group Jorge Gutierrez Lucena. The Army's posture vis-a-vis the Palestinian population has evolved from tolerating settler violence to, at times, becoming openly complicit. In 2015, the Israeli human rights organization Yesh Din published Standing Idly By, a report detailing how soldiers passively witnessed attacks by Israeli citizens on Palestinians and their property, refrained from detaining offenders, neglected to secure the scene for purposes of collecting evidence, and failed to report incidents to the police. 103. Nearly a decade later, Yesh Din's director contends that if for a long time we talked about soldiers standing idly by as settlers commit acts of violence, now we are talking about soldiers standing together with the settlers, a move from passive to active involvement. In one example in May 2021, settlers and soldiers entered several West Bank villages in concert, giving each other directions and firing at Palestinian civilians, killing 4. The IDF has handed off responsibility for enforcing the law against Israeli citizens in the West Bank to the Israeli police. Yet the police, for their part, have failed to investigate most reported incidents of violence by Israeli civilians against Palestinians. İşgalAltındakiTopraklar found that, in the period 2015-2022, police filed indictments in just 7% of 1,531 completed investigations. Of those indictments, only 3% led to a conviction, that is, on just 3 occasions. Analysis of the circumstances under which police closed files revealed that they did not carry out an investigation in 81.5% of the 1531 cases, which means that they made inquiries in only about 130 cases during that 17-year period. The rate of failure to investigate suggests systemic laxity in responding to settler violence. Not only do soldiers neglect to report many incidents, but the police often do not follow through when they do. İşgalAltındakiTopraklar has taken dozens of testimonies of soldiers claiming that the police routinely failed to show up at incident sites to carry out basic investigative duties. The Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency, which has surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities, keeps an eye on violence by both Palestinians and Israelis and has a special department devoted to tackling settler violence, which it refers to as non-Arab terror. But in practice, it has devoted most of its non-Arab terror inquiries to large-scale incidents such as the 2015 murders in Duma, as well as the plots of organizations such as the Jewish Underground in the 1980s and the Bat Ayin Underground 20 years later. A former Shin Bet official said, "Terror is any crime done for ideological reasons and to gain ideological results." The Shin Bet considers settler violence terror, even if they're just cutting down Palestinian farmers' olive trees. But they have to prioritize. Just like when Palestinians throw stones, which is terror, they can't tackle every stone thrower. The Army's response to the large-scale settler rampages in early 2023 shows the challenges. Military leaders expressed anger at the settlers' assault on the Palestinian village of Hawara, for example, with the head of IDF Central Command, Major General Yehuda Fuchs, calling it a pogrom and saying, "We were not prepared for that many people." How they came, the scale, the force of the violence they used, and the planning they had carried out. Following the Hawara events, the IDF allocated more personnel and resources to confronting settler violence. Yet just a week after the Hawara attack, settlers again stormed the village, throwing rocks at car windows and storefronts while celebrating the Jewish holiday Purim. This time, video footage emerged showing soldiers dancing alongside the settlers. Nor did the additional resources prevent or mitigate the next large-scale settler attacks in June or deter smaller incidents taking place daily. After other incidents, too, the Israeli security establishment has publicly condemned settler violence without managing to curb its escalation. The joint statement by IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, Shin Bet Director Ronen Bar, and Police Chief Kobi Shabtai after settler attacks in Termus Aya and Safa in June 2023 drew a line in the sand between the security establishment and the Netanyahu government, at least rhetorically. Reportedly, the Shin Bet has also placed a number of settlers in administrative detention, imprisonment without charge or trial. 16 in 2023, the highest number in decades, and 5 as of August 2024, though the number barely reflects the extent of settler violence. Still, the persistence of large-scale rampages suggests the IDF is unable or unwilling to stop them. Other senior officers have also sounded the alarm. A few weeks after 7 October, when settler violence was surging, Major General Fuchs wrote a letter to the IDF Chief of Staff warning him that the attacks could set off an explosion in the West Bank. He blamed the police for failing to investigate reported incidents and arrest suspects. 113 in his farewell speech on 8 July 2024, as he left his post, Fuchs focused his remarks on settler violence, what he termed nationalist crime, and the failure of settler and religious leaders to rein it in. Shao Arieli, a retired colonel who served as head of the Interim Agreement Administration under the Rabin government 1992 through 1995, said the IDF has not been doing its job. The IDF has failed to fulfill its duty as sovereign in the territory. There are two principles to the laws of occupation: law and order and temporariness. The IDF did not prevent developments that are not temporary and did not maintain law and order. The IDF has chosen a side, contrary to its obligation and duty. Despite heightened public awareness of egregious settler violence and verbal condemnations by senior security officials, settlers mostly continue to enjoy impunity. Those arrested after the Huwara rampage have all been released, and to this day, judicial authorities have not issued a single charge against the participants. The two settlers suspected of killing a Palestinian teenager in Burqa in August 2023 have been released under house arrest, while an investigation reportedly proceeds, with possible charges already reduced from murder to deliberate or depraved indifference homicide. An Israeli soldier watches over rising smoke in nearby Duma town near Nablus after it was stormed by Israeli settlers in the Israeli-occupied West Bank on Saturday, 13 April 2024. Iran, Middle East Images via AFP. A growing soldier-settler overlap. Another reason why settler violence has continued unabated is that growing numbers of IDF soldiers live in West Bank settlements and/or come from Israel's national religious camp. Many senior commanders are graduates of religious pre-military academies and Hesder yeshivas, institutions that combine Torah studies with army service. That instills a messianic worldview while teaching students to identify with the settlement enterprise. Soldiers from such backgrounds are less likely to confront settlers. Moreover, soldiers doing mandatory service increasingly hold right-wing views, since on the whole, younger Israelis are moving to the right. This trend was evident in the 2022 election when at least 20% of IDF soldiers voted for Ben-Gvir, who campaigned on a promise to provide legal immunity to soldiers accused of wrongdoing. In addition to its rightward drift, the IDF in 2020 set up a unit called Desert Frontier, which recruited hilltop youth with a history of violence against Palestinians. The idea was to rehabilitate them, but in reality, the young settlers still attack Palestinians, but now in army uniform. On 12 October 2023, members of this unit, together with settlers, some in partial army uniform, engaged in one of the most severe acts of brutality in the West Bank since the 7 October Hamas attack, beating Palestinian men and a handful of Israeli activists for several hours, urinating and stubbing out cigarettes on them. There have been several other attacks by the Desert Frontier Unit against Palestinians, mainly involving harassment and abuse, which ended with leaving the Palestinian victims abandoned in remote areas with no means to get home. IDF officers who do try to prevent settler attacks on Palestinians can face backlash, all the more so given the political support settlers enjoy from parts of the government. In June 2023, settlers chased an IDF commander from the funeral of a victim of a Palestinian shooting attack in the settlement of Eli, accusing him and the army command of being soft on Palestinian violence and tough on settlers. After settlers rampaged in the village of Safa in response to the Eli attack, this commander had set up a checkpoint in Adarit, the settlement from which the perpetrators of the Safa assault had come, inspecting every car. The settlers argued that the IDF had helped enable the Eli shooting by refusing to set up roadblocks for Palestinians and further restrict Palestinian freedom of movement. Udi Deko, a former head of the IDF Planning Directorate, explained, "When you are out there and don't get political backing or the support of the civilians, settlers, you just want to home, and as fast as possible. It's better for you to watch from the hilltop and see that the issue is contained than to get involved. You have nothing to gain from it. The International Criminal Court won't give you a get-out-of-jail-free card for helping a Palestinian. More fundamentally, the lines between settlers and soldiers are blurred since both are charged with protecting the settlements. After its establishment in 1948, the Israeli state encouraged its Jewish citizens to share the tasks of protecting their communities and maintaining law and order in their own districts. Originally, these territorial defense units were composed of volunteers. The state continued enlisting citizens for this purpose, backed up by the IDF, in the occupied territories after 1967. Facing a hostile population resisting gradual dispossession, Israeli settlers often came under attack, and groups of them turned to vigilantism, both to exact revenge and to impose their will. Against this backdrop, it is often settlers who dictate how army operations are conducted, because they are more familiar with the terrain than an officer posted there for a short time. Settlers also commonly invite officers to their homes for meals and conversations about security concerns. In that way, settlers at times end up exercising de facto authority over the soldiers. Moreover, Israeli citizens who have served in the army and live in a settlement are entitled to carry a weapon for self-defense. The resulting arming of settlers has given rise to vigilantism, when settlers fill security vacuums. Scholar Yagil Levy describes these settlers as the IDF's policing army. Aside from the IDF's territorial defense units, many settlements, religious and secular alike, maintain a military-grade arsenal and operate rapid response squads of resident volunteers known as Kitod Konanut, tasked with acting as first responders in emergencies. Formed in the 1990s and officially under Army command, these paramilitary squads operate under the direct supervision of the settlement Rafshats, a resident Army officer paid by the Defense Ministry to oversee security coordination in his or her community. In the aftermath of the 7 October Hamas attack, as many Israelis concluded that the army was insufficiently prepared to defend Israel's borders and citizens, these rapid response teams have mushroomed throughout the West Bank and inside Israel, with civilian requests for arms multiplying and rules for granting a gun license relaxed. Thousands of men and women from Israeli settlements were called up to protect their own communities as reserve soldiers. In the West Bank, the most significant impact of 7 October has been the IDF's mass mobilization of reservists to free up regular forces for deployment in Gaza and along the border with Lebanon. Thus, thousands of men and women from Israeli settlements were called up under Order 8, an emergency military directive to protect their own communities as reserve soldiers. They each received an IDF uniform, a soldier's prerogatives, a weapon, and an army salary to guard settlements, in effect turning the civilian rapid response teams into IDF territorial defense units. The distinction between settlers and soldiers has subsequently become even fuzzier. In July 2024, the IDF appointed Avi Bluth to head its Central Command, whose remit includes the West Bank. Bluth was born on an Israeli settlement in the West Bank into a family that identified with the political ideology of religious Zionism and studied at the Hesder Yeshiva in the Eli settlement, which is run by radical settlers. This mobilization has expanded the territorial defense units five-fold throughout the West Bank. The IDF has distributed at least 7,000 military-grade weapons to these units, as well as to civilian settlers eligible to carry them. Thus, have some of the very civilians with a record of assaulting Palestinians become soldiers with an even more expansive sense of authority and impunity. It is also even more difficult to document incidents of settler violence when the perpetrators are settlers in army uniform. The failure of Israeli military intelligence to anticipate the Hamas attack and the hours-long lag in the army's response
as Hamas militants seized entire small towns near the Gaza border, has also pushed more Israelis to take community defense into their own hands. The government's far-right members have taken advantage of the breakdown of public trust in the IDF and the state to push their agenda that settlements equal security, that only people living on the edges of state territory can protect those frontiers, provided they have an adequate arsenal and the authority to use it. The Netanyahu government's settler credentials. The formation of Netanyahu's far-right coalition at the end of 2022 catapulted the settler movement into the national spotlight, giving a boost both to settlement expansion and to settler violence as a major driver of it. That December, Netanyahu tweeted the new coalition's guiding principles. The Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlement of all parts of the land of Israel, in the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, and Judea and Samaria. In the November 2022 elections, the Religious Zionist Coalition, comprising the Jewish Power and Religious Zionism parties, became the third largest grouping in the Knesset. Both are religious, ultranationalist parties that champion Jewish supremacy in all the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Many of their members live in West Bank settlements. They identify with and have come to represent the radical hilltop youths rather than the traditional national religious camp or the founding settler movement, Gush Emonim. They say Palestinians should give up all national aspirations and emigrate, or face the full force of the IDF. As part of the governing coalition, they are helping normalize and spread settler violence. They also aim to depopulate and resettle Gaza. After 7 October, the Netanyahu government poured millions more shekels into the settlement enterprise than it had allocated earlier in 2023, despite having to make major budget cuts due to the Gaza war's cost. The official budget approved in early 2023 had earmarked around 300 million shekels, over $80 million, for various settlement projects. After the war broke out, the government chopped this amount in half, but it ended up pushing through various additions on an ad hoc basis, raising the total to over 700 million shekels, almost $190 million in 2023-2024. The money has mostly been set aside for ministries that advance settlements. One is the newly established Settlements and National Missions Ministry, which promotes Israeli civilian activity in the West Bank. For example, the development of farms, outposts, and other construction on land allocated for settlement. Another is a new division in the revamped Negev, Galilee, and National Resilience Ministry, dedicated to regulating illegal outposts, or what Israeli ministers now refer to as young settlements. The government separately allocated more funds for roads, with 20% of the Transportation Ministry's road construction budget directed to West Bank settlements. In 2023, it also issued a record number of building permits for new settlement housing units, nearly 13,000. In addition to regular settlements, there are about 195 illegal outposts in the occupied West Bank. Other settler activity also continues apace. In addition to regular settlements, there are about 195 outposts in the occupied West Bank, illegal under Israeli law because they lack government authorization. While the Netanyahu government has evacuated a few such outposts since assuming power, the majority remain in place, and new ones appear regularly. Settlers established 26 new outposts in 2023, 20 of them since 7 October, a record annual tally. They have erected an additional 10 in 2024 so far. The architect of the government's outpost policy is Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionism Party, who is both finance minister and a minister within the defense ministry.
The latter post has given him control of the civil administration and the coordination of government activities in the territories, COGAT, the two agencies in charge of civilian affairs in the occupied West Bank. He has created a settlement administration within the civil administration, which has impeded the government's ability to evacuate illegal outposts as they pop up, as this subsection must sign off on every evacuation order. Previously, the civil administration could remove an illegal outpost the moment it appeared. Under Symmetric's guiding hand, the government legalized 10 small, isolated settler outposts in February 2023, including Malakeh HaShalom, a herding outpost erected in 2015 on a hilltop overlooking several Bedouin communities that have suffered regular settler violence and are at risk of being driven out altogether. Smitrich has further announced a plan to legalize all remaining settler outposts and is providing additional funds for maintenance of small outposts, which require budgets for sustaining farming and herding, under the rubric of supporting youth. As part of this plan, on 28 June, Smitrich moved to legalize 5 illegal settler outposts, in effect in exchange for releasing funds Israel was withholding from the PA. Attitudes in the Israeli government towards settler aggression are also changing. For years, the Israeli establishment has disapproved of overt violence, considering it a fringe phenomenon involving a few bad apples who deserve public condemnation. Security chiefs regard it as dangerous. Shin Bet head Ronan Bar warned Netanyahu in an August 2023 intelligence briefing that such violence can only trigger revenge attacks by Palestinians. But no longer is this attitude consistent across the Israeli government. Now, senior ministers condone and at times applaud even egregious acts of settler violence. Smitrich, in particular, has a history of racist incitement. He has called for separation of Arabs and Jews in hospital maternity wards, said Israel should have finished the job David Ben-Gurion started in 1948, referring to expelling the Arab population of Mandate Palestine in what Palestinians call the Nakba, and pushed to ban parties composed of Palestinian citizens of Israel from the Knesset. In 2005, he was arrested and held for questioning for 3 weeks by the Shin Bet on suspicion of planning to block major arteries and damage infrastructure to protest the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Israeli right-wing Knesset members Itamar Ben-Gvir, L., and Bezalel Smotrich, R., during the swearing-in ceremony for the new Israeli parliament, the 25th Knesset in Jerusalem, 15 November 2022. Abir Sultan/Pool via Reuters. Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Jewish Power Party, who serves as Israel's national security minister overseeing the police force, has been convicted several times of incitement to racism and support for Kach, a party outlawed in 1988 for being a Jewish terrorist organization. A settler, he is a disciple of Kach's founder, Meir Kahan, who was convicted of acts of terrorism and ousted from the Knesset before being assassinated in 1990. Since assuming his government position, Ben-Gvir has consistently undermined the status quo at East Jerusalem's Holy Esplanade through visits in which he has asserted Israeli sovereignty over the Temple Mount and encouraged Jewish prayer there, aspirations he has made into explicit policy goals. He has taken control of the border police, which is especially active in the West Bank, from the Defense Ministry. Ben-Gvir has also relaxed criteria for obtaining a gun license in Israel, proposed a bill to give immunity to soldiers accused of wrongdoing in the West Bank, and moved to worsen conditions for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. He openly condones the worst settler violence. Ben-Gvir's senior aides and advisors' overt racism is equally notorious. His chief of staff, Hanamel Dorfman, is known for a wedding video in which he appears dancing with knives and pretending to stab Palestinians. A close advisor, Bensi Gafstan, runs Lahava, a group that opposes Jewish-Arab intimate relations and marriages. The Israeli High Court of Justice banned him from running for the Knesset on the basis of his repeated incitement against Arabs. He also has a record of harassing and assaulting Palestinians in Jerusalem. The U.S. has sanctioned Goffstein, and the European Union has blacklisted Lahava. A settler suspected of involvement in the killing of a Palestinian in Burqa in August 2023, Elisha Yared, has served as spokesman for Limar Sonhar Melech, a Knesset member from the Jewish Power Party. Sonhar Melech has openly backed settlers who set up illegal outposts, condemning the military's efforts to remove them, and has called denunciations of settler violence a false and despicable campaign. With their entrance into the halls of power and Likud's further drift right under Netanyahu, such voices give settler violence both passive and active government sanction. When settlers rioted in Huwara in February 2023, several politicians explicitly endorsed the violence. Zvika Fogel, a brigadier general in the IDF reserves who heads the Knesset National Security Committee and is a member of the Jewish Power Party, said the rampage achieved the most effective deterrence since the army's major West Bank incursions. During the Second Intifada, in response, the Israeli judiciary opened an investigation into whether Fogel had incited terrorism but declined to press charges, reportedly on the grounds that incitement to terrorism is hard to prove, plus the fact that Fogel later cautioned people against taking the law into their hands. Similarly, Davidi Ben-Zion, the deputy head of the Samaria Regional Council, which includes Yitzhar, Ilan Moreh, Itamar, and Har Braka, home to some of the settlers who are most notorious for violence, tweeted on the day of the Huwara rampage that the village should be wiped out today, and that the settlers should show no mercy. Smotrich liked the tweet. Several days later, Smotrich echoed the sentiment in a tweet of his own, but with a caveat. I think that Huwara needs to be wiped out, but the state of Israel needs to do it, most certainly private citizens. He subsequently walked back this statement during a visit to the U.S. V. Small steps, sanctions against violent settlers. The U.S. and other states, while claiming to pursue a peaceful, sustainable resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, have consistently failed to hold Israel to account for the settlements and settler violence, enabling successive Israeli governments to proceed with the first and tolerate, if not participate, in the second. In 1993, when the first Oslo Accord was signed, 110,000 Israeli settlers lived in 128 settlements in the West Bank. Today, there are over 500,000 settlers in over 300 settlements, not including occupied East Jerusalem. Violence perpetrated by settlers against Palestinians, unchecked and sometimes abetted by the Israeli security forces, has spiked in recent years. With the exception of the Trump administration, the U.S., including under President Joe Biden, has held for decades that settlements are illegal and an obstacle to peace and a two-state solution. Yet, despite repeated statements condemning settlements, the U.S. has rarely done much to actually penalize Israel for establishing settlements in occupied territory and transferring Israeli citizens there. The closest Washington has come since the Oslo Accords to taking such steps was abstaining from a UN Security Council resolution condemning settlements at the end of President Barack Obama's second term in late 2016, when he was already a lame duck following Donald Trump's election victory. Even then, the U.S. continued to pump billions of financial and military aid into Israel, thus allowing the Israeli government to allocate additional resources to its settlement enterprise. Recent months have seen Western governments take preliminary steps against settler violence. Recent months have seen Western governments take preliminary steps against settler violence, with far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government throwing their weight behind settlers who attack Palestinians, the war in Gaza raging, and much of the world's attention fixed on the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe there, the U.S. took one such modest measure. In late 2023, the State Department issued visa bans for dozens of individuals allegedly involved in settler violence. Then, on February 1st, Biden issued an executive order, for the first time establishing a system for imposing financial sanctions on any non-U.S. person or entity involved in violence in the West Bank. In justifying its move, the White House stated that settler violence undermines the foreign policy objectives of the United States, including the viability of a two-state solution and ensuring Israelis and Palestinians can attain equal measures of security, prosperity, and freedom. The U.S. executive order imposes significant financial penalties on the listed individuals. They are barred from traveling to the U.S., and U.S. citizens or non-U.S. citizens with property in the U.S. are prohibited from transacting with them. Banks and other financial platforms are obligated to respect these sanctions and freeze the assets of or block transfers to the sanctioned individuals. Those that fail to comply may be subject to large fines, legal action, and/or loss of access to U.S. financial markets, which may be crippling for institutions that are U.S.-based or conduct extensive transactions in U.S. dollars. Washington generally reserves such measures for foreign individuals or states it considers pariahs, to coerce them to change their behavior, cut off their funding sources, punish them for wrongdoing, or push them to negotiate, or some for combination of these reasons. Issuing this order constituted a departure from Washington's previous stance against settler violence, which in practice amounted to little more than rhetoric. Because the sanctions were introduced by Biden, widely recognized in Israel and among its supporters in the U.S. as ardently pro-Israel, it has been hard to accuse him of anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment. In clear defiance of U.S. sanctions, settlers rampaged across areas of the West Bank in April. In early May, the U.S. threatened further measures against violent settlers, and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan accused right-wing Israeli gangs, many of them settlers, of completely and utterly unacceptable behavior when they blocked convoys carrying aid through the West Bank to Gaza, looting the trucks and assaulting the drivers as police officers and soldiers stood idly by. In clear defiance of U.S. sanctions and threats of more, settlers rampaged across areas of the West Bank in April, 2 months after the U.S. executive order, while Israeli soldiers, as before, watched. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Smotrich announced the appropriation of an additional 40 acres of West Bank land as state land, meaning it can be used to build settlements. Sanctions targeted at private persons are a good first step, but the U.S. and other Western states need to find new ways to press Israel to change its approach in the West Bank. Spotlighting settler violence is worth doing, as is blacklisting individual settlers. But Western governments confuse the cause of the problem with its symptoms. They ignore the elephant in the room, the Israeli state policy, at least as tweeted by Prime Minister Netanyahu, aimed at holding on to the West Bank, annexing it, and dispossessing its Palestinian population. The settlement enterprise is the centerpiece of that policy. Israel cannot, as the U.S. appears to suggest, be part of the solution to settler violence until it stops being part of the problem. An Israeli outpost, Center, now occupies the area where the Al-Baqa Bedouin community once lived before being forcibly displaced. Dark patches on the ground mark the former locations of the Bedouin tents. September 2023, Crisis Group, Jorge Gutierrez Lucena. V. Tackling settler violence and Israel's settlement policy. If Western states looking for a durable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict want to have any chance of moving Israel in the right direction on settlements and settler violence, they need to show in both word and deed that they see the Israeli state as complicit. With the V. Tackling settler violence and Israel's settlement policy. If Western states looking for a durable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict want to have any chance of moving Israel in the right direction on settlements and settler violence, they need to show in both word and deed that they see the Israeli state as complicit. With the U.S. embroiled in elections and neither Democrats nor Republicans keen to focus on this issue as the Gaza war and regional escalation persist, nothing is likely to happen at least until a new administration takes office in January. It is probably safe to assume that Trump returning to power on the Republican ticket would give full support to Israel's settlement enterprise, as his first administration did in 2017-2020. Were Democratic candidate Kamala Harris to prevail, she appears likely to hew largely to Biden's Israel policy, though there may be space to build on his sanctions to impose further costs on Israel for further settlement construction and especially violence by settlers. Given the surge in both settlement approvals and settler violence since the Netanyahu government took office, sanctions against violent settlers are a useful start. Yet the U.S., the U.K., and EU member states could go a step further, namely by extending individual sanctions to members of the government who abet such violence. Those should start with Smotrich, the de facto West Bank governor, and Ben-Gvir, who is in charge of the police. These two political leaders, on whom Netanyahu relies to remain in power, endorsed the de jure annexation of the West Bank, they call it applying Israeli sovereignty, and provide fellow settlers engaged in violence against Palestinians with the state's political, economic, and legal backing. They also repeatedly call for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the rebuilding of Israeli settlements there. In Washington and Brussels, leaders are reticent to sanction elected officials in office, and the EU would struggle to reach the necessary consensus among members to do so. Still, such measures would send a strong signal that the far-right ministers are a big part of the problem. Other Western governments, including the U.S., European governments, and the EU, should follow Canada's lead and consider sanctions against entities like Amana, the collective behind a large portion of the settler herding outposts that Canada sanctioned in June, as well as the regional settlement councils. The 2005 Sasson report identified those local authorities as the engines driving illegal settler outpost construction, and that remains the case today. The councils could qualify as sanctionable entities under the U.S. executive order, given that it applies to any government official or entity. Sanctions may convince Israeli banks to freeze their shekel accounts, as they did for some of the settlers already sanctioned by the U.S., or stop foreign donors, many of which are based in the U.S., from sending contributions. Given that these organizations are the main drivers of settlement expansion, even a slight curtailment of their activities could have impact on the ground. To combat the settlement enterprise, the U.S. could start by making use of tools and policies it already has. Furthermore, to combat the settlement enterprise, the U.S. does not need to introduce new tools and policies. It could start by making use of those it already has. Washington, for example, could begin by enforcing the Lehigh laws, which prohibit U.S. assistance, e.g. training or equipment, to a unit of a foreign armed force if the Secretaries of State and Defense have credible information that this unit committed a gross violation of human rights, such as extrajudicial killings, rape, torture, or prolonged detention without charge or trial, instances of which Israeli, Palestinian, and international human rights organizations have thoroughly documented. The Lehigh laws apply to such violations committed by Israeli forces in the West Bank. They do not apply to actions by private Israeli citizens such as settlers.
While the Lehi laws do not impose a sanction or any other kind of punitive measure, enforcing them would mean the U.S. moving to de-exceptionalize Israel in its foreign policy more broadly, because it has never cut assistance to an Israeli unit under these statutes, despite an abundance of documented evidence of gross violations. In practice, to comply with the law and its own policy, the U.S. should stop assistance when it has credible information that a violation has occurred. Assistance should be authorized only after the Israeli military unit allegedly at fault has been reviewed and the U.S. has determined that the unit's actions meets the exception in the law. By applying the Lehi laws to Israeli military units, especially those with the reputation for committing violations, the U.S. could help reduce army violence against Palestinians while sending a powerful message that the IDF's overall conduct in the occupied territories cannot evade U.S. law. The Biden administration appears to have considered restricting aid to Israeli units under the Lehi laws. In late April, ProPublica
reported that Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, had for months been sitting on memoranda recommending action under the Lehi laws to end assistance to Israeli military units responsible for gross violations of human rights. Soon thereafter, the State Department asserted that 4 of the 5 units identified had met an exception in the law because Israel had remediated the violations, and thus the units were eligible to keep receiving U.S. assistance. Despite the U.S. knowing about these incidents for years, it allowed aid to keep flowing to these units, though at the time no exception under the Lehi laws applied. The 5th unit is the IDF's Netza Yehuda Battalion, which is notorious for its violence against Palestinians. This battalion remained eligible to receive U.S. assistance even though the State Department held credible information about its violations in the West Bank. On 9 August, the State Department announced that Secretary Blinken had determined that the violations had been remediated despite Israel having taken only administrative measures against the alleged perpetrators. The U.S. could also refrain from transferring arms to Israel if it knows Israel is likely to use them to commit violations of the 4th Geneva Convention. This measure would require a policy shift from Washington, though the Biden administration has already taken steps to ensure that U.S. origin rifles are not destined for settler militias. Indeed, U.S. law arguably requires such a move, given that West Bank settlements, in and of themselves, violate the convention. The Arms Export Control Act, which governs U.S. arms sales, specifies the purposes for which arms may be sold, with the pertinent justification being legitimate self-defense. The State Department has in the past interpreted legitimate self-defense to entail compliance with the laws of war, which would include the 4th Geneva Convention. In addition, the conventional arms transfer policy, adopted by the Biden administration in 2023, prohibits the sale of weapons if it is more likely than not that they will be used to commit grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions or other serious violations of international humanitarian law. State parties could start signaling that Israeli military personnel and settlers responsible for grave breaches could be prosecuted if found on their territory. Moreover, the 4th Geneva Convention requires state parties to prosecute or extradite for prosecution perpetrators of grave breaches, equivalent to war crimes, in occupied territory. In the West Bank and Gaza, such violations might include the willful killing of protected persons and the destruction of property not justified by military necessity. State parties have an obligation not just to comply with the convention, but to enforce compliance by others, such as Israel. As such, state parties could start signaling that certain Israeli military personnel and settlers responsible for grave breaches could be prosecuted if found on their territory. Prosecutions would send a clear message that Israel is not above international law. It would indicate instead that the Israeli judiciary's failure to take remedial steps will make more and more Israelis vulnerable to indictment for war crimes under the principle of universal jurisdiction. The investigation by the International Criminal Court, operating under its own jurisdictional rules, highlighted this risk when its prosecutor on 20 May requested arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his defense minister, along with 3 Hamas leaders. EU member states also should take actions they have long considered, which would put them in belated compliance with their international law obligations and their own regulations. Divisions within the EU undoubtedly complicate collective action. Still, some of these steps have been considered by European diplomats in the past, notably when Netanyahu threatened to formally annex the West Bank in 2020, during his previous stint as prime minister. Human rights organizations, in light of the July 2024 ICJ advisory opinion, call for still stronger measures, including for the EU to impose a comprehensive arms embargo. First, the EU and member states should continuously review agreements and cooperation programs with Israel to ensure they do not apply to occupied territory. This step would be in line with the EU's existing policy of differentiating between the State of Israel and the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, in all cooperation agreements, trade policies, and EU funding. It would also be in line with the July 2024 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which declared that states have an obligation to abstain from treaty relations, diplomatic relations, economic or trade dealings, or investment relations with Israel in all cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the OPT, the occupied Palestinian territories. So far, EU institutions and member states have not applied this policy consistently. For example, the EU has not systematically included a clause in its cooperation agreements with Israel that indicates inapplicability to the occupied territories. It should do so now, including in cooperation with European financing instruments such as the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and scrutinize the follow-through more closely. EU member states could take a firmer stand by banning trade and settlement products entirely. Moreover, as per the Commission's 2015 guidelines, EU member states should ensure that relevant products on sale in Europe and subject to origin labeling requirements clearly show their settlement origin so that consumers are not misled. EU member states tend to apply such differentiation inconsistently. They should do so coherently. They could take a firmer stand, as the Belgian Prime Minister has advocated, by banning trade and settlement products entirely. Secondly, the EU should review whether Israel is complying with its obligations on human rights and democratic principles under the EU-Israel Association Agreement and suspend the accord or parts of it if it finds Israel to be in breach. The agreement, which entered force in 2000, fosters closer economic, political, and cultural ties between Israel and the EU. The deal provides Israel with beneficial trade terms that have significantly boosted Israel's exports to the bloc, one of its largest trading partners, while also giving Israel access to valuable cooperation projects in various fields from research to energy, including the EU funding program for research and innovation, Horizon Europe, with an overall budget of €95.5 billion. Ireland and Spain have asked the European Commission to review the human rights obligations under the agreement amid Israel's war in Gaza, though their call has gained little traction. Short of a proper review, EU member states reportedly asked Israel instead to hold a special meeting of the Association Council to discuss respect for human rights under the association agreement, but Israel refused the meeting in this format. Thirdly, EU member states, especially those that are major arms suppliers to Israel, should also consider closer adherence to the EU's arms control policy, especially when it comes to equipment that risks being used for repression in the occupied territories.
The EU Common Position on Arms Exports applies to all member states and sets out 8 criteria they must consider before granting an export license for military technology and equipment to another state, including Israel. These criteria are supposed to ensure that arms exports do not contribute to internal repression, international aggression, or human rights abuses. Final decision-making authority lies with individual member states, however, which can lead to diverging interpretations of the common position, as has long been the case with export licenses for Israel. Such steps by themselves would not end settler violence, much less the settlement enterprise. But they might at least prompt reflection among Israeli officials about the potential cost of proceeding on a course diametrically opposed to Israel's allies' stated objectives regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They would be the clearest signal to date that Washington and Brussels, among others, are clear-eyed about the Netanyahu government's role in settler violence. Conclusion. Events of the past months, the 7 October attack on Israel, Israel's devastating war on Gaza, and escalating army and settler violence in the West Bank underline that unresolved, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only lead to greater bloodshed, suffering, and regional instability. Finding a path toward a sustainable solution is as urgent as ever. Any such effort should, at the outset, be two-pronged. Crisis Group has argued separately for the pressing need for Palestinian political renewal, including a rejuvenated leadership that commands greater public support. The second imperative is greater effort to hold Israel accountable for its actions as an occupying power, especially its settlement enterprise and the ensuing violence by settlers, who increasingly enjoy protection, if not outright sponsorship, from state institutions. Even as the U.S. and other external actors push for a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of Israeli hostages, they need to do more than broker a deal between Israel and Hamas. Israel's settlement enterprise and the corresponding dispossession of the Palestinians is slowly killing off any hope of a durable resolution of the conflict. Settler violence is the cutting edge of that enterprise. The impunity with which settlers act and the fact that hardline Israeli leaders and government itself pay no price for failing to rein in and increasingly supporting their aggression not only risks leaving the conflict on a downward spiral, but has, over time, empowered the most lawless elements of Israeli society. For too long, countries avowedly dedicated to a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have allowed this situation to fester. Their policies will not change overnight, but even a strong signal to Israel that its approach is not only pernicious for the Palestinians, but also an act of self-harm could generate adjustments that, cumulatively, might point the way to a better future.